I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videri. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
Good morning. My name is Mel Wright with the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. We're honored today to do an interview for our historical video series with former Chief Justice Burley B. Mitchell, Jr. We're here in his offices at Womble Carlisle. And Chief Justice Mitchell, thank you so much for allowing us to talk with you today.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you and wonderful to have this opportunity.
Great. Rather than go first into your biographical background, which we'll touch on, why don't you just tell us, in your opinion, what some of the major issues are that are facing our profession today?
Well, the profession, like every other profession, I suppose, has just a problem of overload, sensory overload. We're too much in contact by cell phone, personal device, personal communication devices and laptops, and we never have any downtime. And everything is moving at so much greater speed that it's difficult to even keep up with one area of the law, much less the way we used to years ago to keep up with, to be generalists. That's becoming a thing of the past. So the profession is changing dramatically over to a group of specialists, or so-called boutique practices, which is good and bad. It ensures that we have actually more expertise, more real knowledge, but of narrower areas. And one of the things that concerns me about that is the danger that we will lose sight of who we are as lawyers and where our place really is in society. We're not just business consultants. We're not just hired guns litigating in a courtroom. The legal profession is the only profession that is a part of the government. When a person takes the oath as an attorney, she or he becomes a officer of the court, which is, as you know, 1/3 of the government, and we have a duty to the public unlike any other professions. We really do have an obligation, a legal obligation to perform for the public in addition to that for our clients. And the only way to really understand that place we have, I think, is to understand history, to understand a little bit of legal philosophy, judicial philosophy, that you can't bill a client for. And I sense that fewer and fewer lawyers have that broad overview of just where the place of lawyers and the rule of law is properly in a democratic representative democracy like ours. And of course, to my mind, well, and I think I'm right, I don't think there's any question about it, the rule of law, having neutral decision makers review the other branches of government and review the actions of private parties with regard to each other has separated us from all the other governments in the history of the world, really, and has given us the stability to now be the oldest democracy in the history of the world. It's protected us from revolution and social chaos from time to time. And people just don't really, I think, don't learn in history classes today, and lawyers don't either, the importance of that that part of our government. I mean, you know, the other governments have guaranteed more rights than we do. More, you know, the old Soviet Union's Constitution guaranteed many more individual rights than ours does. It's just there was nobody there to enforce it. And we've developed this independent judiciary, lawyers being a terribly important, well, absolutely necessary part of that independence. And I'm concerned that as we become more and more involved in more and more narrow areas, we will, as they say, we'll lose sight of the forest for being down in the trees and bumping into them. So it's a real challenge, I think, going forward.
Is there anything in your mind that we need to do as a profession to better address that problem?
Yeah, I think some of it we can do simply by retrenching in our legal education and in our early training of young lawyers as they come out of law school. When I was in law school, we used to always bemoan the fact that we weren't learning enough practicality. We weren't being trained about how to go to the courthouse and file papers and all that sort of thing. And we were being taught, we thought at the time, just too much legal theory and not enough hands-on going and doing things. Looking back, and I was one who was critical of that very thing at that time, but looking back at it, I think the classical legal education we were getting was better for the long run. A lawyer is going to learn very quickly where the courthouse is. They're going to learn which deputy clerk down there handles estates and which one does other things, and learn where to find the advice and guidance they need. And to my mind, it is not the most efficient use of law school time training people on the nuts and bolts, which is what we tend to do now with the seminars and laboratories and so on. But instead, we need to have people well grounded in the philosophy of the law, where its place is in society, and otherwise we lose it. If you don't know your history, you will lose it. Or as whoever it was, Santayana or one of the philosophers said, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. When we didn't have the rule of law, or times when it's been weak in Western history, you've had chaos. So I think it is really important to go back, move back toward a more classical education in the schools. There'll be plenty of time for the practicalities. And also, it's important that young lawyers have someone to guide them as to how to properly practice law and how to deal with each other, how to deal with their clients and treat them decently. And most of that's not in the books anywhere. And most professors don't know it. They haven't practiced. You know, they've been in school. Most of the professors have a route now. It seems that they're excellent law students, write for the law review, clerk for a judge, and then come to teach at the law school with no real practical experience. So I don't think they're the best ones to teach it anyway.
During your history as working with the Attorney General's office and as a judge with the Court of Appeals and then as Chief Justice and being on the Supreme Court and now with Womble Carlisle, you've had an opportunity to see a number of young lawyers to whom you could mentor, I'm sure. Do you remember anything about your experience when you first started about the importance of a mentor, and do you have any thoughts and ideas about that today? Yeah,
absolutely. When I got out of law school, and I was probably part of the last group that was still small enough that everybody had a mentor. And then the dam burst right behind us, and we began to produce really large classes of law graduates and sort of overwhelmed the profession. It was like trying to drink through a fire hose the way it was coming down. But when I got out of law school, everybody, we used to say, was well in hand. Some older lawyer had each of us under their supervision and would from time to time tell you, we just don't treat each other that way. And there was nothing in the books. You were going by the rules. You were moving to dismiss some person's case because of some imagined or real deviation from the rules and so on. And if you do that, if you practice gotcha law, it really messes up the system. It puts everybody on edge. Everybody's spending all their time trying to either take advantage of each other or be sure they're not being taken advantage of, and not focusing on the merits of their cases or their clients' needs. And we used to wave people off from that. Now I see more and more lawyers trying to sneak up on each other, file papers at the last minute, wait until they think the other lawyer is going to be gone from the office to fax something over. That's sort of way people just shouldn't treat each other that way, and certainly not in a profession. We hold ourselves out as being a little above that sort of thing. So mentoring really helped with that. And now we're being unfair to a lot of young lawyers are coming out who really have very little opportunity for guidance and to be taught the right way to do things.
And I'm assuming, therefore, that you think we need, as a profession, to take more interest in the mentoring effort to be sure new lawyers have someone they can turn to at times of questions that come up and how to handle situations, to be sure that beyond law school there is some practical training that goes on from somebody that's been there.
Yes, absolutely, and I should give credit where it's due. I think the the North Carolina Bar, both the state bar and the Bar Association, the voluntary and the mandatory bars, have pretty consistently tried to create programs that would encourage mentoring, particularly focusing on the person who is young sole practitioners or those who don't have anybody real close at hand, to pair them with an older, more experienced practitioner that they can use sort of as a sounding board and a confidant. Go ask questions that you might otherwise be embarrassed to ask. And those efforts have been pretty consistent, although up and down, as with everything else. You have to come back and refresh them every once in a while. The Supreme Court, when I was there and since, has encouraged this sort of thing. And so I think our profession is doing probably a pretty good job. I'd give us a high C anyway. And I will say we probably do a better job of it than most professions. So I don't despair, but we really do need to stay on top of that.
How and why and when did you decide that you wanted to go into the law?
Well, I'm not one of these people who grew up knowing I wanted to be a lawyer. No lawyers in my family. I was about to finish undergraduate school. I came back from service and was in school on the GI Bill, and I had an offer of a fellowship at University of Virginia in political science, and which would have been a free ride. But I began to look at that, and I began to think, well, it's interesting. I'm certainly intellectually stimulated, but it doesn't lead to actually affecting anything. And I observed that most of the people, and this would have been in the 60s, who were affecting the country for better and worse, whether it was in legislatures or the Congress or just out in the community leaders, seemed to be overwhelmingly lawyers. The training prepared them for it, their work prepared them for it, the logical thought processes, and it seemed to me that that lawyers, when they went to small communities or large ones, pretty quickly got involved in the civic and social and political lives of their communities. I wasn't at that point, I mean, I certainly wanted to make a good living, but I wasn't really driven by a desire to get rich. And it just seemed to me that that would be a good way to make a living, support my family, and perhaps have a little bit of opportunity to sort of decide the direction of where we were going, where we were going as a society. So it has worked out that way. I think it's a perfect blend of the practical and the academic, and a good way to make a living, but also a good way to help other people.
I know you finished North Carolina State in 1966 and then went to Carolina Law School and finished there in 69. When you finished in 69, was there more public service, community service involvement by lawyers in your mind then than we see today?
Yeah, I'm confident that was the case. I'm certain that was the case. But that was true of everybody. Everybody then, you know, we were following behind the World War II generation, and they had been through a depression, saved the world literally from totalitarian governments, and they came back and they were going to doggone well be sure that they had a hand in everything, that we, you know, that never again did somebody just drift off into darn near destroying the world. So they were tremendously active in the civic clubs. There was a whole group of them who went to Congress, then including the presidents, you know, Nixon and Kennedy, and of course President Eisenhower, who'd been overall commander of the European theater. But those people were tremendously involved, and that's who was running things as I got out of law school. And all of us of our generation, I think we felt, and we had it impressed on us, that we had an obligation as a favored group in society. We had a duty to participate. And so everybody, most everybody, that got out with me immediately became involved in one of the service organizations, whether it's Kiwanis or Lions or Rotary or, you know, Civitan, whatever, Ruritan. And also we took, I think, more interest in government, both local and national, and felt it was part of our obligation, and perhaps we felt we could affect things more than people do today. I sense a sort of a feeling that, well, you can't ever change things, and almost defeatism today that we didn't. I think we were still too idealistic to have. So, yeah, I think there's been a decline on the part of lawyers, and that's regrettable, because I think we really do have to show the way in public service.
You said one time that a wall of silence will be our demise. I remember that quote from you that I think is a very interesting quote. Tell us what you meant by that.
Well, it's all, I mean, that's true anywhere in public life. That though if you sit by and let things decline, you might as well be helping them decline, which is just to say that we need to speak out. We need to be involved. We need to be involved in both the public issues of the day as well as in our churches with the spiritual controversies of the day, and just across the board. The obligation of a citizen is more than just to sit back and take advantage of all of the benefits of society that others have created over the generations. You've got to put something back. And if we sit back and let it drift, whether it's the legal profession or anything else, then we're complicit in making things worse, which means you got to take some risks. You have to run the risk of offending some people if you take a position they don't like. But that should be viewed, I think, as just one of the risks of living in a free society. You cannot be silent. People sat back and watched every dictator that came on the scene, whether it was Hitler or whomever. That's a good example, though. People kept saying, well, somebody's gonna wise up and straighten that guy out, and no need for me to get out there and get involved. And there is. Right. There is.
And as a self-regulating profession, each individual lawyer has a responsibility, if they see someone violate our rules of professional responsibility, to report it or to do what they can to stop that from happening. And that goes along, I think, with what you're saying, that the wall of silence is a problem if we're not willing to abide by our self-regulating.
Yeah, that's a particular point. And that of course, is, as you say, we are self-regulating. That's what really distinguishes a profession from a business, is that we police each other, we discipline each other. Most businesses don't. Any discipline comes from outside. It's either it's the law, generally, whether it's some legal agency set up to police the stock market, or just a general, the general laws regulating corporations and so on. But we regulate ourselves, and we are the ones who see and know of violations. So if we don't do something about it, we really harm the public. We actively harm the public. And there is that obligation. I always thought that the military academies had that right, West Point and Annapolis and so on, that a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate anyone who does. That's pretty straightforward, simple code. Don't have to have a lot of situational ethics about it. You won't lie, cheat, or steal, and you won't put up with anybody who does, and you'll blow the whistle on them, which is always uncomfortable. But that is our obligation, and if we're able to do it, it strengthens us. And to the extent we don't do it, to the extent we let things go, we absolutely make a contribution to the decline of the profession and ultimately to our civil society.
How does professionalism figure in to that? And by that I mean there are certain ethical standards that you're referring to that we have to abide by. And yet professionalism seems to be a little different from just that. And I know you started the Commission on Professionalism back when you were Chief Justice. Can you kind of talk about how professionalism relates to ethics and professional responsibility?
Professionalism, as you know, we've always said goes beyond just complying with the rules. It's aspirational, and you're trying to encourage some traits that we found too elusive to really regulate by a set of rigid rules. Some of what I was referring to earlier, just treating each other decently, and not taking unfair advantage. Certainly don't sacrifice the interest of your clients, but not taking unfair advantage just to gain a little edge here or there. That sort of thing is not written down in the rule books, but its application makes, the application of things like that make the profession function more efficiently, make it certainly more humane, and puts more of a human face on it. And it is terribly important. Dean Pound up at Harvard Law School made the statement in an article he wrote years ago that everybody who's interested in professionalism is familiar with. And he says that a profession is a calling. It's not, like the ministry, like preaching or some doctors really feel called to heal. So a profession is not just a job, it's a calling. You feel called to it. And it's a calling whereby a person serves humanity. That's the first thing. It's a service to your fellow humans. And coincidentally, but only coincidentally, makes a pretty good living. I mean, truth is, lawyers make pretty good livings. Some make very good livings. But that should not be the focus. And if it is the focus with too many of us over too long a period of time, we will lose what sets us apart. And that has always been the public service aspect. That's why the public has tolerated, I won't say they've liked it, but they've tolerated lawyers to a large extent running huge parts of society. The courts don't have any army. The courts don't have the power to tax, and yet our citizens and the other branches of government have submitted their disputes to the courts. And it's not because of any power or any fear of the courts. It has been because they have trusted the goodwill and public service motive of those of us in the legal profession over generations. Despite all the lawyer jokes, we may not be very good, but we're better than everybody else for that purpose, for resolving disputes. And they continue to come to us. Alexander Hamilton, when they were preparing the Constitution, in describing the judicial branch of government, he said it would, unlike the legislative and the executive branch, unlike the president and the Congress, he says, the judicial branch will always be the least dangerous branch. And remember, they were just coming out of a dictatorial situation where the king had denied them a lot of their rights. He says the judicial branch will be the least dangerous branch, having neither the power of the purse or the sword. In other words, they don't have money to spend and they don't have force to apply. So all you've got is the trust of your fellow citizens and what's called moral suasion, the fact that they believe that you are a moral person trying to serve neutral principles of law, not trying to gain personal advantage. And if we ever lose that, we've lost the profession.
We hear a great deal today about depression and burnout among older lawyers. What would you say to them about rekindling their flame, if you will, and interest in practicing law?
Well, that is a terribly difficult question. There's burnout throughout our society now. We hear it. We're all so-called multitasked. I find myself going down the hall with this little personal handheld information device, checking emails as I go down, bumping into walls and all that sort of thing. We're doing too many things, and people do feel stress, and they are burning out. But I don't think it's so much the enormity of the work as it is the sense of something missing. And I think what it is, if you really look at it, is we need to, and boy, I know this sounds quaint and every generation said it, but we need to sort of recalibrate our compasses. We need to refocus on what is important to us. And I think if we do that, most of us will say, well, you know, I'm making enough money. I'm spending too many hours and too much energy being stressed in the practice of law and really focusing on the billable hour and getting in one more piece of legal work. And I'm not focused enough on my family, my church, my community. The only way to do that, you can't have everything, and that's something's hard for Americans to realize. We've been told for so long we can have something for nothing in this society. You use it now and pay later, but you can't. I mean, the only way to, I think, to do away with stress is obviously a lot of us work too many hours. I mean, just too many. We're up too many hours. and awake, and that just requires some real life adjustment. But within those hours, I think that people will feel less stressed and feel more fulfilled. And if what you're doing is fulfilling, if you feel good about what you're doing, it's not stressful, it's not really work, it's your joy. And I think the only way to ever do that really is for your work you do to have some strong service component where you actually, if you can feel that you're making things a little better, it's not stressful. As you know, Mel, I spent 30 years to the day in government. I retired on my 30th anniversary in office. And I can honestly say that every day I got up looking forward to going to work. And I think the reason was because I was in positions where I was sort of hands-on, could affect things, could move things some. I made plenty of mistakes. Now, probably some days I made things worse, but every day I was trying to make them better. And most days I could come home and say, well, I did a pretty good job on this or a pretty good job on that. Of course, everything I did well, there was 10 more I left undone. But that enthused me to come back the next day. And I really despair for young people in the profession who come in the morning dreading it. I mean, if people are that way, they ought to do something else. Life is too short to do anything unpleasant every day. It really is.
Sort of leads us to your starting out as, I'll say, a government lawyer. You started with the Attorney General's office and then went into the court system, and now you're in private practice with North Carolina's largest private firm, Womble Carlisle. If someone is thinking about getting out of law school in the next couple of years and trying to find a job, can you kind of tell us a little bit about the differences between being a government lawyer and being on the court and being in private practice?
Well, in public service, it is obviously much easier to see the public service component when you are a government lawyer. And it's a lot easier, I think, to sort of keep your eye on the ball of what I think makes you happy, which is, as I say, doing something positive, feeling that you're making a positive contribution. It's there in private practice, but it's not quite so easy to see. And I think you have to focus a lot more on keeping it up as one of your first priorities than you do in government. The private practice, you are serving people, but you're serving them one at a time, helping them with their individual problems or their corporate problems or whatever. And it is a very positive contribution, but it's a little harder to see it than when you're out here doing government work. One of the things that concerns me, and I'm very pleased to see our profession has begun to address, is the difficulty nowadays for young people to have an initial career in public service. When I got out of school, of course I was fortunate. I had the GI Bill and a good wife who worked while I got my training. So I came out of school broke but with no debt. Right. And I was able to go to work first for the Attorney General's office, and then I was elected district attorney in Wake County, and then various court positions and government positions. But I wouldn't have been able to do that 15 years later, carrying the debt that students were carrying coming out of college, and particularly coming out of professional schools. One of the things that the profession has done that I think is really beneficial to the profession and society is to begin to develop in the law schools programs that forgive debt of students. So many kids come out now with carrying these huge debts that it forecloses the possibility of their going into public service. They just don't make enough to keep body and soul together and pay down that debt. So some of the schools now have begun to have, many of them have begun to have programs whereby they will forgive debt if somebody goes out and works in a public defender's office or a poverty law center or in prosecutor's office or wherever. And I really hope we can continue that. For many generations, the law was a profession primarily for those who came from wealth. And we missed a lot of good people. And it's really important that we draw in people from all levels of society who have the intellect and the desire to be involved in the profession and who want to make it a public service profession. And the best way to do that is, as with most things, is to keep it open so that each generation you can draw the best in wherever they happen to be and put them into service. So it has become more difficult now than it was when I came along to enter public service right out of school, but I think the profession, particularly the law schools, has begun to address it, and we're trying to keep the system open. And that is one of the most important things you can do in a representative democracy. You've got to keep the system open, not a welfare state, but so that those with ability can rise.
Chief Justice Mitchell, we've been a profession of storytellers. When you try a case or argue to a jury, it's oftentimes involves a story. Are there any stories about you or cases that you've had that are humorous that our people would like to hear you tell about? I know that, knowing you as I do, there are many of those. Does anything come to mind today that you'd like to share with us?
As you say, there are a lot of them, and you know, lawyers are big storytellers, and we can tell a lot of what we call war stories. You know, yes. Courtroom stories. I've really been blessed. I spent a lot of time trying cases to juries as a DA, and then a lot of time in the appellate courts and otherwise, and in public life. And in all of them, you have communications are a great thing. I'll tell you one little, just one, and there are thousands of things you can tell, but I never will forget, I was in court one day, and Jim Blunt, who's a senior member of the bar as we speak, and has been inducted into every Lawyers Hall of Fame there is nationally, particularly for trial litigators, was trying a case, and he got up and made this impassioned argument, and you know, just we were all convinced it was a wonderful argument and just would have overwhelmed the jury. They had no way they could resist that argument, and it never hurts us to remember that these practical people are a whole lot more intelligent than maybe we give them credit for. But the juror came up after it was all over there and said, Mr. Blunt said, that's some argument you made, and Jim was saying, oh, well, thank you. That's, you know, they're expecting the guy to say that's just, you know, that you're the most brilliant orator since Socrates or something. And the fellow says, yes, sir. He says, you know, you the first windmill I ever saw that ran on water. And every time Jim would make an argument, he'd take a drink of water. And so the fellow said, you the first windmill I ever saw ran on water, which kind of brings everybody back into perspective. And that's one good thing about courts. You can never, when you're dealing with our court system, you can't ever get but so puffed up because the jurors or the judge or just the situation brings you back to earth. That's one of the reasons I always, and that's terribly important, to be out there and to be rubbing elbows with people who don't let you become delusional about your abilities or your brilliance or anything else.
No question about it. As you said earlier, professionalism has always been considered an aspirational goal that we are striving for. What do you do, in your opinion, when you're faced with an unprofessional lawyer? What's the best way to handle that, in your opinion?
Boy, that is the eternal question. and I have, with you actually, over a period of time, developed some answers. One of our, two of our partners here, Erna Womble and her husband, Bill, had prepared a continuing legal education program on that very question, and it's a hard one. I think there are different facets to it. One thing I've always thought you do is sort of kill them with kindness. If someone is being unprofessional, be all the more professional. If they are cutting corners on you, well, for example, just a very simple example, you have lawyers who will refuse to give you a continuance when a continuance would not in any way inconvenience or harm their client. They do it just to try to keep you off guard, or just because they're that sort of folks. Well, inevitably, after they refuse and you have to go get the court to grant you the time, or you just go ahead and get your stuff ready in time at great inconvenience, inevitably that person will have to come to you and ask for one. And I ask for a continuance, and I always say, well, yes, of course. You know, I'm not going to, that's the way I treat other lawyers. Now that, again, that's not the rules, that's just civility, yes. The sort of the grease that makes things run smoothly. So the first thing I would say is you deal with a person who's showing signs of unprofessionalism just by setting an example for them, showing them how it is done, sort of like Jesus Christ did. You know, here's the way you live a life. Although there's no real comparison there. And then the second thing is, and this is terribly distasteful, is you have to be willing to take formal action. You've got to be willing to report, not at the drop of a hat, not tit for tat. You know, you're being an obstructionist, so I'll get you. But you've got to be willing where there is a real violation, and one that is going to go uncorrected. Otherwise, you got to be willing to report it. Report it to the judge, take it before a judge for corrective action, or report it to the bar, and then follow up on it. And that is the most distasteful thing in the world. Not only is it distasteful, it's a distraction. It takes away your time, which you need to be, and most lawyers are just loath to do it. And every one of us, if we're truthful, has seen things we know ought to be reported and not done it. You know, either way, I'll get around to that later, or I'll do it at the end of this case. I'm not going to do it right now. And then you get to the end of the case and you win it, and you say, "Oh, the heck with it," you know. And that's not good. That is one area where I think, as a profession, we fall down. Most professions do.
Right. Yeah. But of course, giving prior notice of your intention to report if things don't change, to give that lawyer every opportunity to do it the right way, so that you don't file something at the drop of the hat, or you don't register a complaint. Yeah, that's you definitely would want to do that. Of course, there's some things where the first time you have to report them, but you know, the really serious things, and you should do it promptly and be ready to back it up. And the bad thing about it is, it's always uncomfortable to do things like that, to report things on people you have to deal with regularly, that you're going to practice against regularly. But as I have often said, there's nobody else going to police the profession. And if we don't do it over a long enough period of time, people will rightly look around, and particularly Congress, congressional representatives and legislators, and say, well, this crowd's no different than any other business. Why in the world are we letting them regulate themselves? They need FCC to look over their shoulder, and we'll set up a government agency just to regulate them and treat them like every other business. And when that happens, you've lost the profession. Yes. Judicial independence and the election of judges is a hot topic right now. Do you have any thoughts about that subject?
I have more thoughts than you have tape, but I won't share them all with you. I have become convinced that well, first, let me say, there is no perfect way. There's not even a really great way to select judges. because you can never know what's in another person's heart, and a lot of times they can't. They don't know what kind of judge they're going to be. They don't even recognize their own biases or weaknesses and so on. We have had the elective system of judges, partisan elections in North Carolina all my life, really going back to about the time of the Civil War, I guess a little after the Civil War. Up until then, they were selected by the legislature. And it served us well for generations when basically we were a one-party state, and so the elections were, in fact, nonpartisan. They were all within a primary, so you didn't have the partisan aspect to it. And in those days, most judges came to the bench by appointment of the governor initially. They ran one time, maybe had an opponent, and then from then on, if they were doing a good job, people left them alone. So they had job security, but at the same time had enough of a threat that if they really got out of line, the public could get at them, that it kept them from becoming arrogant. So for several generations, that system, I think, functioned real well. It began to break down in the latter quarter of the 20th century, when we began to have more and more hotly contested elections, a lot more candidates for judge, and almost nobody runs anymore without an opponent. And judges were hampered by the code, judicial code, or canons they're called, which prevent them from speaking on a lot of issues. So all you could do is run a beauty contest. I went to law school here, there, and so on. So I've become convinced the only way to do it and consistently get, if not the best person as judge, good solid judges, is through an appointive system. I personally prefer just a straight-out gubernatorial appointment, counting on governors to care enough about their own legacy to appoint people that can do the job, and then follow that with what's called a retention election. You don't run it; it's just a yes/no. And if the majority vote no and throw the judge out, someone else is appointed, and then they'll have to stand the next time. The federal system is a pretty good system, whereby they're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and served during good behavior. But the problem with that is that with that system, I think, is that it removes judges too far from the people. And particularly when a judge has been up there 25, 30 years, they really almost universally tend to forget that they're not there just because they were the brightest, most able lawyer, which is never the case. They're there because they were a good lawyer, you hope, would make a good judge, but also because they had been involved enough that in public life that the president knew who they were or the governor knew who they were. And it's a pretty good mix. So I about decided the best way is either to have appointment, follow up with retention elections pretty far apart, and mandatory retirement at the end of some period, whether it's 20 years, 25 years. And I think the federal system would be greatly improved if there was mandatory retirement. The cost of judicial salaries doesn't even register a blip on the screen of the cost of government. It is so little because there are not that many of them. The salaries aren't that high, and the tax base is so big. So what I would do is just say you serve 20 years. You will then get full pay, which is what federal judges do. They don't have a real retirement. They just continue on. You're 20 years in, full pay, and you can't ever hear another case. And that way, most of them would never get so far out of touch that they became arrogant or overbearing or too much anyway. But there is, I used to have real strong opinions on the subject of judicial election or judicial selection methods. But there are a lot of opinions. There are a lot of good arguments for any system. It's not something I have much vehemence about anymore, but I've come to think that we really need a change to an appointive system of somebody who has more reason to know who will make a good judge than most of us out in society do.
Right. When you were Chief Justice, one of your duties as head of not only the court, but also of the administrative office of the courts was funding for the judiciary. You had to deal with the legislature as far as the funding was concerned. That's another hot topic, if you will, that is discussed throughout our courthouses on a daily basis. Do you have any thoughts concerning the funding of the judiciary in the state it's in today?
Yeah, it's at the state level, certainly the judiciary is underfunded. You're getting more and more cases, and running with about the same number of personnel. We're certainly not increasing personnel as quickly as the population's increasing and as the court loads are increasing. The way our courts are funded is, as I said, the courts have no money of their own. They can't levy any taxes, so they have to be funded primarily by the legislative branch of government. And the funding has been, I think, inadequate. There are many needs that have to be met, including a lot of technology needs now that is so expensive. The networked computers and all that sort of thing, and the software and the training of people to use them is much more expensive than it used to be. All we had basically was our salaries. The counties picked up the cost of the building, and you had to keep it heated, and that was about it. A little paper, some pens. But now there's a lot of technological expense, a lot of other things. The courts can't levy their own taxes, and they can't pass their own budgets, so they're constantly having to go to the legislature as supplicants to beg for money. And they tend to be put in just with every other group that wants money out of government. And we lose sight of the fact that this is a co-equal branch of government that the Constitution requires be funded by the legislature. At the federal level, the problem has been somewhat solved by the fact that the judiciary there, the Chief Justice, submits a proposed set of expenses. And they go over and present them to Congress, and Congress appropriates money in a lump sum. Primarily in two major categories, one for personnel, one for everything else. And then they let the courts manage that money and decide, okay, we got limited funds, it's needed here more than there, and move it around. At the state level, though, it's line item appropriate. And if the courts halfway through a budget year need to shift something from one thing to another, frequently they can't do it. They'll have funds there that they can't shift. So there's a real need to give, I think, the courts not just more money, but more flexibility with the money they have. Whatever the job is, the person doing it, if they're pretty intelligent, reasonably intelligent, can tell better where it's needed and exercise the flexibility needed to serve the public in that particular branch of government. We don't do that. The overall spending is too little. It's constantly hovered at a little bit under 3% of the total appropriations of state government go into the whole judicial branch of government, which is, all the courts, all the DAs, the clerks of court, all of those offices, and everything else involved in handling the cases. And so it is really just a very small part of government, and a little more money would make a difference. But the thing was set up with a little bit of that problem envisioned and intended, that the courts not just have unlimited resources and unlimited ability to go out here and poke around in things that weren't their business and work mischief, but there is a definite need in the courts now. There's a need for more long-term planning, which is difficult to do in any aspect of government, because the legislature funds on an annual basis, and they constantly changing priorities. But you wouldn't run a business that way. You need at least a 5-year plan and some consistent funding, and we haven't had that.
All right. One of the things that I find most impressive about your resume, and it's extremely impressive, and we're going to include it at the end of this, is that as a judge, you authored 484 appellate decisions for the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals for North Carolina. 484 appellate decisions. That is a huge number of appellate decisions. Is there any particular case that stands out in your mind, or any particular case that you've tried since being in private practice that you'd like to talk a little bit about that really was an important decision that made an impression?
Well, first, 484 is a big number, but there are plenty of appellate judges who've written more. The Court of Appeals writes many more opinions than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Courts usually tend to be a little longer and a little more thorough. It's just the nature of the two courts. But judges really do work, whether people want to admit it or not. It's very time-consuming and at times tedious. But there are cases, I suppose in any career there's a handful of cases that will stand out to you. One of the first cases I ever dealt with, I'd been out of law school about 3 years, which is the time required to be licensed in the Supreme Court of the United States. And this case came along called Rodriguez against the San Antonio School District. It was a case out of Texas involving the issue of whether the Constitution of the United States guaranteed a publicly funded and provided education. And all of the states piled in there and filed amicus brief, a friend of the court brief. And I was on that, so my first case up in the Supreme Court was in a situation in which we took the position that the federal Constitution says nothing about education, which it doesn't, and therefore there was no right just inherent in there anywhere. And that was the ruling of the court, was that there was no right. And then along in my last a couple of years before I left the state Supreme Court, one of my last cases was what's come to be known as the Leandro case, in which the issue before the state Supreme Court was, does the state Constitution guarantee a right to an education, to a government-provided education? And I wrote the decision for the court saying that yes, there is a right in our state Constitution to what we call a sound basic education. And that's one that enables you. It's broad-based reading and writing, mathematics, science, and the social sciences, enough to allow you to function as a citizen and to either go on to higher education or to fulfill or to fill a place in the workforce effectively. So I started and ended the career pretty much with the same issue. And at the state, of course, I was the person making the decision, one of the seven, and we decided there was a right. And of course, that's a case that will go on forever because it'll constantly be reviewed in perpetuity forever as to whether in any given year the state's meeting its obligation in that regard. So that was one sort of crowning achievement, I would say. It's certainly the case, I think, if I am remembered at all, it's the one that it's the one people will read more frequently than the others.
A wonderful decision. You've been a remarkable public servant, leader, lawyer, judge. What has been the most important thing or things in your life that you are comfortable sharing with others that might want to emulate or pattern their lives after you?
Well, of course, you're talking about really getting down to basics now. In order to function well in any position, but particularly in stressful ones and particularly in the public realm, you have to be sort of secure and comfortable within your own skin. And the only way to do that, I think, is to be at peace with your God and with your family, and with your community. It's terribly important that your own spiritual and moral well-being be addressed first. Then what I would say is that the best thing you can do is just what we've done when you and I have talked many, many times about professionalism, and that is to treat anything you do as having a certain societal obligation, a public trust, if you will. I think that's what the legal profession is. The public entrusts us to do the right thing for them and in their name, and it's certainly true of public office. And if you treat it that way and really do it sounds trite and glib, but if you spend your time trying to make things a little better, trying to improve the condition of your family, your society, and humanity around you, I think you find life pretty rewarding. And I think I mean, it may be Pollyanna-ish, naive, but I think if you do that, you have a pretty good chance of success. At the very least, it keeps your compass firmly in place, and you don't get distracted, and you don't get confused about what's the meaning of life, and I believe I need another drink or something. It really helps you to maintain a focus in your life and one that's beneficial to others.
Right. Finally, let me thank you for starting the Commission on Professionalism. I think that was a good thing for you to do for the lawyers and judges of our state, and to thank you for all you've done for the citizens of North Carolina and the country, and to thank you for spending a little time with me this morning talking about who you are in your life, and I very much appreciate it.
Oh, I thank you. It's my privilege and it's been my honor to serve and to be associated with folks like you, Mel.